Hello, this is November 27th, 2020. My name is Stuart, and here we are about to read Chapter 2 from Messages from Frank's Landing, A Story of Salmon, Treaties, and the Indian Way by Charles Wilkinson. Yesterday, I posted the introduction in the first chapter, Muck Creek, and that got us started on the story from the origins of the ancestors of the Squaliobsh people, now known as the Nisqually tribe, and through to the settlement by the colonialists and the expansion of the white population in the 1800s, and Manifest Destiny, Chief Lachey, and the U.S. Nisqually War, Willie Frank, and other family of Billy Frank Jr.'s, and Chief Lachey. So, if you haven't heard that one yet, you can go back and watch that Chapter 1. And this is Chapter 2, Nisqually River. That river was my life. You understand it right from when you were a little boy. The winter floods, the spring floods, the low summer water. We lived right on the bank, right near the edge of the tidewater. At Frank's Landing, you know exactly when the tide comes in and when it goes out. And there was a relationship between your life as a little boy and the salmon. You knew that every year the salmon came back. Spring salmon, summer salmon, fall salmon, then the winter run of chum salmon up to Muck Creek. Then the cycle would start over again. We lived in that river all summer. Every day, fishing, swimming. We had an old wooden bridge, the old road we called it. It's not there anymore, it got torn down after World War II. But back then we'd dive off it. We had a swing attached to it. We'd get up on the bank, get up on that rope, and swing way out in the deep water, then let go, swim back, and do it again. We'd drink the water. Frank's Landing was a meeting place for all the children. Not just the Indian kids, but all the farmers' kids, too. All the Braggett kids would come over. We were neighbors. We saw the changes in the river every year. The river would meander, and we used to run up to the new log jams it made. We were always looking for cedar logs to make canoes. We'd climb all over the log jams and dive off. We'd walk 6 miles or more up the river to find those log jams. On the way, we'd stop at the farmers' orchards and eat apples. As a boy, Billy loved going down to Nisqually Reach, where the river hits Puget Sound. The family would make day trips in the canoes, down with the tide, back up to Frank's Landing with the tide. The Reach was on a main flyway. When I was a kid, we had huge numbers of birds. Eagles, ducks, geese, big white swans. God, those white swans were beautiful birds. Eagles, ducks. Oh, well, I repeated a line there. On the day trips, the Franks would bring back oysters, clams, and fish. Jesus, there were flounders all over the place. We'd just wade in, wiggle our feet, and when you felt one, just reach down and grab it. We'd keep the ones we wanted and throw the others back. But new pressures were building. In 1935, when Billy was just 4, his dad suffered his first arrest for illegal fishing. More and more non-Indians were moving into the Puget Sound area, and the state began singling out Indian fishermen who were not getting state licenses or following a state seasons or take limits. The Nisqually River spring run of Chinook, the biggest and best-tasting fish, went into decline in the late 1940s, falling victim to the unregulated offshore commercial boats and to hydroelectric development. The end of World War II proved to be a decisive moment for the Pacific Northwest. The Boeing Company, whose sales had skyrocketed during the war effort, became the anchor of Puget Sound's economy, continuing to produce military aircraft during the Cold War and expanding to include the commercial airplanes by the 1950s. Electronics and aerospace industries moved in and international trade flourished. The suburbs mushroomed in response to people's appreciation for the region's clean air and outdoor lifestyle. In eastern Washington, a burgeoning demand plus good growing conditions in the Yakima and Wenatchee valleys and elsewhere led to irrigated bumper crops of apples, pears, and other specialty fruits and vegetables. Washington as a state grew from 2.3 million people at the close of World War II to nearly 6 million at the end of the century. The Puget Sound area expanded threefold, shooting from 1 million in 1945 to 3.3 million in the late 90s. The non-Indian salmon take rose sharply in the years after the war. 46 Puget Sound commercial gill netters fished for sockeye in 1945. The number leapt to 322 in 1953, to 637 in 1957. There were 121 seiners in 1945, 452 in 1961. Salmon and the aerobatic steelhead were pursued avidly for recreation by newcomers flooding into the Northwest. Washington put a daily 2-fish limit on sport fishing for salmon, but an annual commercial license with no daily limit cost $15. As a result, sport fishermen regularly purported to take up commercial fishing. Population pressures brought wholesale habitat destruction. The short, steep rivers running from the Cascades to Puget Sound created outstanding opportunities for generating electricity to fuel industrial and residential development. The city of Tacoma seized one of these opportunities with its generating facilities on the upper Nisqually River. The hydroelectric projects of Tacoma and the city of Centralia, to which we will return, pounded the salmon runs on the Nisqually. At the same time, fueled by the baby boom, the housing industry cranked up and the nation looked to the Northwest for timber. The Forest Service enthusiastically responded. By 1965, timber harvests on the national forests climbed to a level 11 times higher than before the war, and in the process trashed valuable salmon habitat. Private timber companies worked their lands ever more intensively. Urban and suburban development, including road and highway building, ate away at the vitality of watersheds. Poisons, especially 2,4-D and other pesticides used in forestry and agriculture, found their way into the rivers. When I was a kid, Billy laments, the fish were so damn clean and healthy. The quick flashes of silver that embody the natural bounty of the Pacific Northwest went into freefall. The 1960 non-Indian commercial Chinook take dropped by more than half from the 1940s. Other species went into similar declines, or worse. All the troubles of race, of the environment, that had been lying dormant but dangerous for decades welled up after World War II and threatened to rework once again the lives of the Nisqually people. By the 1960s, the state's sporadic arrests, like Billy's first one back in 1945, had escalated into a relentless law enforcement campaign of raids and stings. As Judge George Bolt would find in 1974, after exhaustive hearings, Indian fishermen had not wasted or harmed the runs. Regardless, for the state enforcement officers a decade earlier, it was a holy crusade and they would give no quarter. They saw these Indians as renegades who were flouting state conservation laws, sensible and valuable laws that had been adopted for good reasons. They saw this lawless Indian conduct as a main reason the runs had crashed. Now the salmon runs themselves hung in the balance. Billy Frank's early life gave no particular indication of the role he would play in the historic confrontations over the Pacific salmon. At 6, he started out as a first grader at the Nisqually Grade School. The 2-room wooden building was close enough to Frank's Landing that he could walk to school. He spent his last 2 years of elementary school at the Lacey Grade School and then moved on to junior high in Olympia. His formal education ended after the 9th grade. I'll pause there to read the caption for this photo you see on the screen here. This is the old Nisqually Grade School, 4 blocks distant from young Billy Frank's home. A similar trek took him to Nisqually for mail and groceries. The wee wayside town and general delivery post office vanished with the construction of I-5 in 1968. Billy fished from his canoe and peddled the salmon, suffering a few random arrests and confiscations. He also took on odd jobs out of the American Federation of Labor Union Hall in Olympia. The union members had first call on the jobs, but Billy, who had no union card, was a good worker and regularly scared up construction work on the roads and sewer systems. In 1952, at the age of 21, he fulfilled his dream of becoming a U.S. Marine. I took real pride in that, the discipline, the hard training. I was in good physical condition, always have been. After 2 years with the Corps, he returned to Frank's Landing, his salmon trade, and construction work. But if it is true that Billy's first 3 decades scarcely suggested what was to come, it is also true that a standard account of a budding activist's education and jobs rarely reveals the personal qualities, churning and building over the years of a young life, that will cause a person to assume the burden of challenging accepted authority on behalf of a sacred cause. Rage at history, rage at the present, will show up on no resume. Neither will the growing realization that Lashai's spirit lives on in your own soul. Al Bridges and I were out on the river in the fall of 1964. It was an afternoon like this one, sunny, warm. Billy was talking from the stern of his 18-foot aluminum boat. He turned off the motor so he could drift while he showed me this stretch of river, about a mile from the mouth of the Nisqually. Al and I were in a canoe that Johnny Bob had made for me. I always kind of smile when I think of Johnny. I'd be out walking and I'd see all these ladders, just 2x4s, nailed to trees. They were all over the place. One time I saw Johnny hammering one of them, and I asked what he was doing. He told me he couldn't see so good anymore, and he staggered when he walked, and that the deer always heard him coming. He was a subsistence hunter, and he wasn't getting any deer. So, he tells me, I put these ladders up in trees next to deer trails, get up in the tree, and when a deer comes by, I shoot him. Johnny Bob, what a guy. He's having trouble getting deer, and what does he do? He puts these goddamn ladders up in the trees. And he knew how to carve a great cedar canoe. Anyway, I was taking Bridges out to get his nets. And, here I'll switch to the next picture. On the top here is Billy Frank, pictured as a Marine in 1952, and on the bottom there is Al Bridges. The quote there is, Al Bridges, 1922 to 1982, and his wife Maisel raised their 3 daughters, Suzette, Valerie, and Allison, at Frank's Landing. When game wardens rammed and capsized Billy's now famous canoe, Al was arrested too. Back to the story. Anyway, I was taking Bridges out to get his nets. We were just having a good time. We were right about here, and see that slough over there? Billy pointed toward the east side of the river. I shouted out, Bridges, Jesus Christ, there's the state! At the beginning, these guys had no idea how to run a boat on this river. They didn't understand the river. We figured out their favorite hiding places. If there weren't any ducks around, we figured the state guys were in there and had scared away all of the ducks. But they got real serious about this, and this was the time of Selma. There was a lot of unrest in the nation. Congress had funded some big law enforcement programs, and they got all kinds of training and riot gear, shields, helmets, everything, and they got fancy new boats. So all of a sudden, this boat was coming at me in Bridges like a bat out of hell. We turned upstream and tried to run him into another net, but we never made it. Those bastards rammed us at full speed and knocked us clean over. We had our hip boots on, and it was harder than hell to swim. I honestly thought I was going to drown. We finally got to shore, and other guys were waiting for us. Stop or we'll shoot! These guys had a budget. This was a war. Indians never did trust any of these guys, and don't to this day. We didn't write those laws. That's why we try to write the laws today. They hauled us by boat up to a marina in Tacoma. We were still soaking wet. By the time we got released, it must have been midnight. We got fined and had our salmon and nets confiscated. They confiscated Johnny Bob's canoe, too. That was one of the worst of all the episodes, but stuff like that was going on all the time. It was nearly a daily event to get hassled by those guys. It was a good day if you didn't get arrested. After a while, I didn't even bother to tell people at the landing because they already knew. If we don't come back home, call C.J. Johnson. He was the bail bondsman. By the mid-1960s, Frank's Landing, along with the demonstrations led by Bob Satayacum, Ramona Bennett, and other Puyallups on the Puyallup River in Tacoma, had become the focal point for the tribal assertion of treaty rights in the Northwest. The landing also lay at the moral center of the tribal sovereignty movement nationally, as tribes began to climb up out of the termination abyss of the 1950s. The goal of termination, which Congress had announced as the official Indian policy, was to end, forever, the special status of Indian tribes, sell off the reservations, end the long-standing education and health programs, make Indians subject to state laws, assimilate them into mainstream American society. This policy was every bit as focused and dangerous as the attacks on land and culture during Lachey's day. The drama at Frank's Landing began in earnest in January 1962, when the state mounted a major raid on Nisqually fishermen during the winter run of chum salmon bound for Muck Creek. The state's campaign did not subside for more than a decade. The confrontations flared up, of course, only when the salmon ran. It is worth noting that, in between runs, life was generally peaceful at the Frank family compound on the broad flat at the bend of a river, along the west bank. 4 modest frame houses sat amid the old maples, fir, cedar, and dogwood. Billy's mom and dad lived in the family house, closest to the river. Billy's sister, Maisel, had married Billy's fishing partner, Al Bridges, of both Nisqually and Puyallup blood, tall, trim, and elegant in his red headband. They had 3 daughters, Allison, Valerie, and Suzette. Billy and his wife, Norma, lived in another house with their son, Tobin, called Sugar, and their daughter, Maureen. The other home was for Billy's nephew, Herman. Billy's dad kept a garden, corn, rhubarb, and squash. Maisel grew flowers. I'll pause here to point out this next photo. The caption says, "At age 13, during October 1965 confrontation with fisheries wardens, Allison Bridges Gottfredson became a veteran of the fish war skirmishes. Years later, as a skilled fisherman, she expertly motors the swift, turbid Nisqually River." The families struggled to patch together a living. The salmon, when the state didn't confiscate them, gave some subsistence and small income. During the summers, Al, Maisel, and the girls worked nearby farm fields. Billy went on the road as a lineman, erecting tall towers and stringing electrical lines in British Columbia, Montana, Idaho, Washington, and down to Oregon. But during the runs, Frank's Landing was hyperactive, white hot. The surveillance was continuous. This photo is Maureen Frank. She lifts a salmon from her father Billy's catch just days after his jail release in 1968. 2 years later, her younger brother Tobin, at age 9, would experience his first arrest. Treaty rights claims centered on a Puyallup River Reservation fishing encampment in 1970. A 300-man police force surrounded the encampment, indiscriminately firing tear gas and shotguns and arresting all 62 occupants. And pictured here is Billy Frank Jr. In 1968, gill net inefficiency was demonstrated amidst hundreds of visible king salmon in Olympia's Bud Inlet waters. No salmon were caught, but observer Billy Frank was carried off to jail. Continue the story here. There were scores of raids, many of them, preserved both in front-page photographs and a great amount of film footage, ugly, heart-rending brawls. In time, the banks of the Nisqually merged with the schoolhouse steps of Little Rock, the bridge at Selma, and the back of the bus in Montgomery. The game wardens, a dozen to more than 50, would descend the banks in a stone-faced scramble toward a few Nisqually men in a canoe or skiff, unloading salmon from a gill net. Usually the Nisqually would give passive resistance, dead weight, and 5 officers or more would drag the men up the rugged banks toward the waiting vehicles. The dragging often got rough, with much pushing and shoving, arms twisted way up the back, numerous cold punches. The billy clubs made their thuds. Sometimes the Indian men struck back. Sometimes Indian people on the banks threw stones and sticks at the intruders. The stench of tear gas hung in the air. Pausing there to read the quote on this, or the caption rather, on this photo. Federal court decisions barely fazed state fisheries agencies. Their continued enforcement actions were quickly challenged by Indian fishermen. Norma Frank is shown here under state arrest, being dragged from her boat on the Nisqually River in 1969. The Nisqually women got involved too. Film footage shows Maisel Bridges and Billy's wife Norma clinging desperately to the nets as the officers dragged them forcefully up the rocky riverbank. As with all the blood struggles of minority people for freedom the world over, a sorrow, a poignancy shared the air with the tear gas. Yes, all the young, clean-cut, crew-cut officers charged down the banks toward their duty, fixed on fulfilling their oaths to enforce the law. Good law, so they believed. And yes, for some of them their eyes remained cold during the ensuing brawls. But in other young eyes, one could see the questioning, the sadness. Why does it have to be this way? Is this right? The caption of this photo is, Extensive national news coverage of the 1970 arrests at the Puyallup fishing encampment helped ensure filing of United States v. Washington. This dramatic photograph of Allison Bridges Gottfredson gained wide public attention. The people at Frank's Landing learned to endure the grimness of the arrests, combat, confiscations, fines, and jail time. They had a banner to carry. It had fallen to their generation to defend the treaty and Lachey's legacy. Though the odds might have seemed long to others, their spirits were high. They knew that Billy's dad and a few other Nisqually fishermen had obtained a federal court injunction against state interference with their fishing back in 1937. They had no truck with the Washington state courts, but they had faith that the federal judiciary would honor the treaties. They used the term supreme law of the land, and they understood what it meant. They had support. Frank's Landing hit the news and gradually came to be recognized in the active 1960s as a place to go and honor a noble cause. Actor Marlon Brando came, lending his name to the effort. Canadian native folk singer Buffy St. Marie sang to her sisters and brothers. Luminaries of the future, Richard White, later a leading historian of the American West, and Elizabeth First, who became an Oregon congresswoman in the 90s, stood on the banks of the Nisquallys and heard the messages. The black comedian Dick Gregory drew national attention and also lightened the skies. The Indian people liked him and his humor. At one press conference, a reporter asked Gregory if he had been offered tribal membership. His response was, "No thanks, I've got enough problems." Business was also part of the scene. One point, after all, of the Medicine Creek Treaty was the commercial sale of fish. The The tribes had always traded salmon with inland tribes for goods from their regions. After white people came, as Isaac Stevens knew, Indians sold fish to the farmers. I'll pause there to read the caption for this next photo. Within tidal reach, sloping banks and gravel bars made Frank's Landing a natural boat launch and mooring site. It once featured the lower Nisqually's last fixed cable ferry crossing. Willie Frank's original 1884 allotment was the farthest upriver on the Nisqually Reservation. Frank's Landing is the Indian land farthest downstream. In modern times, the salmon made up one part of the struggle to break up the grip of poverty. So, when the Nisqually could get their fish out of the river and past the police, one objective was to get some of the salmon to market. Local buyers would pay only 10 cents a pound, but a pound of salmon would fetch $1 in more distant markets. Some of the most delicious moments at Frank's Landing during the 60s and 70s took place after nightfall, as Indian people loaded bright, freshly cleaned Nisqually salmon into a plain white truck bound for Union Square in San Francisco, properly launched into the dark with a Frank's Landing send-off of muffled laughter, and sotto voce whispers of "Go get 'em, and you're doing the Great Spirit's work." This photo here is by Mary Randlett. For generations of tribal fishermen and distant canneries, Frank's Landing was the principal Nisqually buying station. Buyers brought their customary portable scales to temporary stations after the last fish house disappeared. It was kaleidoscopic. Family, armed arrests, fierce resistance, Indian people from all over, celebrities, Black Panthers, SDSers, hippies, common well-wishers, surveillance from across the river, smoke emerging from the smokehouses and wood stoves, commerce and the processing of fish, Indian humor and laughter, earnest talk of treaties, federal courts, and the Constitution. Yet in certain ways it was an organized chaos. Billy's dad finally had stopped fishing in the early 1960s, in his 80s, but he was an anchor, giving people encouragement, walking around tapping the maples and cottonwoods with his cane to show the old trees he was still there. Billy was an anchor too, but his life was down on the river. His river, the river that ran in his blood, defending that river and his people and their way of life. His defiant image and words went out over the newsreels and in the papers, and were passed along by word of mouth, giving inspiration to Indian people and displaying to the larger world the fury and staying power that native people would summon forth in defense of their land. "We aren't," Billy would proclaim time and time again, "going anywhere." While Billy at that time was not a tactician, "I was not a policy guy, I was a getting arrested guy," he jokes. His sister Maisel Bridges was a major strategist in getting out the Frank's Landing story and organizing the drive to secure the treaty rights. Her 3 daughters also took part. Allison and Suzette took on all manner of organizational tasks. Valerie proved to be a riveting speaker. "We set the net and waited for the state. We have to let them know we're not going to stop fishing. We have this treaty right, the supreme law of the land under their Constitution. It's a treaty we're fighting for." At the very center of the strategy was the activist Hank Adams. Tireless, fiery, chain-smoking, lights-out, brilliant, and soul-deep loyal to a sacred undertaking. Adams, an Assiniboine and Sioux from the Fort Peck Reservation in Montana, and a great-grandson of Sioux Chief Yellow Eagle, came to Washington as a child during World War II. From day one he was a gifted student, but it figured that no college could hold his restlessness and his 6 a.m. till noon sleeping hours. And after 2 years, the University of Washington proved in 1963 that it could not. Adams had more pressing business. Although still in his teens, he had steeped himself in the Indian history and law, including the extreme assimilationist policies that Congress and the Bureau of Indian Affairs pursued during the 1950s and early 1960s. Indians had long been mostly passive on the national scene, leaving a leadership vacuum. Along with other young charismatic Indian intellectuals, Vine Deloria Jr., Clyde Warrior, and Mel Tom, Hank Adams quickly became a national leader, bent on change. He joined the National Indian Youth Council as an organizer, and in that capacity arrived at Frank's Landing in February 1964. And this photo is Hank Adams speaking at a 1970 press conference at the Seattle Center of the American Indian Women's Service League. With Adams are Allison Gottfriedson holding 1-year-old Powhatan Mills and Mike McLeod. Adams dove into his new task, mapping out a grand scheme but also precisely crossing every T and dotting every I. "You're too patient," a Nisqually friend told him. "No," Adams responded. "I'm most impatient. I want to take the time to do it right, so I won't have to spend my life here." But for once, Hank Adams had it wrong. He never left, and Frank's Landing is still his life. Adams' first job back in 1964 was to organize the wildly successful demonstration. 2,000 supporters showed up at the state capitol in Olympia. Pictured here. The caption is, "Don Matheson addresses a rally of treaty rights supporters at Washington's Temple of Justice, at which plaintiffs for the United States v. Oregon, so happy, litigation, from Cook's Landing on the Columbia River, also spoke." And if you're familiar with this show, you may notice that this is the exact same place that many protests, of course, still occur. The scene is quite familiar to folks here. And it's an excellent reminder of how recent this history really is. The book continues. He enticed Charles Kuralt to bring out his CBS show to cover the saga at Frank's Landing. He brought in Brando. He instigated and facilitated 3 stirring film documentaries, In the Shadow of the Eagle, Treaties Made, Treaties Broken, and especially Carol Burns' As Long as the Rivers Run. He helped to conceive and to secure the funding for publication of Uncommon Controversy, a report sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee on the Washington Fishing Rights Controversy. Uncommon Controversy, a well-written, fair-minded, scholarly treatment of the issue, went into several printings. The grassroots organizing, the political rallies, the documentaries, and Uncommon Controversy may begin to suggest the range and depths of Hank Adams' vision. There is much more. And the caption for this next photo reads, "Nisqually fishermen in January 1965 signaled distress and an aid appeal. They raised the inverted American military funeral flag of tribesman Herman Buck John, killed in a Battle of the Bulge, 1945. The last Frank's Landing fish house stands as a backdrop." The grassroots organizing, "I came back to my office," University of Washington law professor Ralph Johnson recalled, "one day in the spring of 1966 after teaching my class in property law. There were at least 15 natives in my office. I could barely get in the door. Hank Adams and Bob Sotiacum were the leaders. They told me they wanted to teach a course in Indian law to undergraduates. I resisted at first. I had no background at all in the field." Ralph Johnson was in good company. At the time, other than a course in Oklahoma on Indian land titles, no one in the country was teaching Indian law. But few people have had much luck resisting Hank Adams. Over the next 2 years, Johnson taught the undergraduate course, and in 1969 he began teaching Indian law in the law school. Johnson continued until his retirement in 1999, having taught American Indian law longer than anyone in history. And although trained as a traditional legal scholar, he didn't mince his words about the fishing issue. This was an injustice. It was entirely wrong. The state was being repressive and racist. By the 1960s, a great many things had been set in motion. Perhaps most important, the cause of the Nisqually and other Northwest tribes had acquired a dignity, a moral content that was understood and appreciated by a great many Americans. This was of no small moment. In a democracy where tiny minorities by definition lack the numbers to influence policy by their votes, recognition of their rights often in fact turns upon morality and the appreciation of it by a wider citizenry that does have the numbers. Sometimes that morality is manifested in legislation, as it was with the sweeping civil rights laws of the same era. In the case of the Nisqually, where the morality was already embodied in a federal law, the 1854 Treaty, the logical recourse was to enforce it in the federal courts. They knew they would be walking a long road. And pictured here, well, the caption reads, "After 6 fishermen were jailed for contempt, a resistance organization was formed in 1964. Canoeing on the Nisqually, SAIA founders Janet McLeod, bow, Don Matheson, and Al Bridges, navigator, prepared to lead a Frank's Landing fish-in 1966. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 2. I will put a link below to the first chapter in the introduction if you didn't catch that, and also to the next chapter as well if you're ready to jump along. You're looking back once they're all posted. So thank you all for tuning in, and hope you have a wonderful day.